I read the articles around it, and my sense was that the Chief Justice was concerned about certain vaccines. There are different types of vaccines that have been developed for COVID, and some of them use gene technology in order to target the immunity and enhance the immune system against the virus.
Yeah.
Those are referred to as the mRNA vaccines. Now, I anticipate that the Chief Justice was specifically talking about those vaccines. And I suppose, I mean, his approach was largely spiritual rather than scientific. So I'm not going to be able to comment on the spirituality.
No,
But
sure.
on the scientific side of things, what I can say is that all vaccines, when they are developed, or any medicine for that matter, is assessed in clinical trials where the adverse events are evaluated. And thereafter, once the vaccine is evaluated by an independent regulator, like they did in the US and the UK, the same will happen here in South Africa, then the vaccine will be used in country, and we will monitor the effects of the vaccine. So if any adverse event were to develop, we would immediately intervene in that case. Remember, we register medicines every day, and every medicine has a benefit. It also has a risk.
Yeah.
And the benefits in the case of vaccines far exceed the risk. If you take a Panado tablet, it also has a risk. But the benefits of taking the paracetamol clearly exceeds the risk. That's why most people would be able to take it without much adverse events. So the similar thing would happen in the case of vaccines. Yes, there are a few people that would not be able to take vaccines. For example, if you're hypersensitive to some of the proteins that are in the vaccine, then your doctor will advise you, please don't take the vaccine because you're likely to throw an allergic reaction, which can be quite serious in your case. But the vast majority of people, we would anticipate, would be able to tolerate a vaccine quite easily, yes. If I can just say a little bit about the genetic manipulation and development of vaccines. This genetic work that's been done on the mRNA vaccines has been used in other pharmaceutical interventions for treatments such as cancer. So it's not entirely new technology, what we've been using for many years. It is new in the development of vaccines, yes, but historically over the years, there has been a number of products that have been developed using this type of technology. So I think the concern around it needs to be understood in its context.
Yeah. Dr. Pillay, thank you very much for that clarity. It's much appreciated. I want to, while we have you on the line, talk about some other developing news around the pandemic here in South Africa and, the fact that the health minister himself has now said that we are in the grips of a second wave of infections. There's a lot of discussion, of course, around what the president might say in his address to the nation this evening. As the Deputy Director General of Health, what are some of the interventions that you believe are now necessary as we are faced with the issues around, the surge in infection when it comes to matric rage and various other incidents where we've seen exponential rises in infections?
I think the interventions that we need to put in place are, firstly, the legislative interventions, but I also want to talk about some behavioral things. I think, firstly, on the legislative side of things, gatherings are probably the biggest driver of infection, whether you spoke about the rage, but similar events. And linked to the gatherings are often the use of alcohol, which seems to contribute to that. So for me, restricting the gatherings with number of people and what type of gatherings one could have, and secondly, the use of alcohol in these gatherings are critical. And if you look at the data post the rage, you can see that the highest proportion of people that were infected are largely in the 15 to 25-year-old age group now, which was different previous to that, largely because of the rage event. And I think if we continue to allow that, we're going to see a multiplier effect in terms of the number of cases. So we do need to intervene on gatherings, on alcohol. For me, those would be the key things to intervene on. But I also want to say, in addition to the legislative interventions, we need to also implement behavioral change. And sometimes as I walk around, I see a number of people walking around without masks. And I think it's our civil duty to remind our colleagues that, you actually forgot your mask because they're putting themselves at risk, but they're also putting the people around them at risk and their own families and friends at risk. So it's important that I think as a collective that we are able to educate our fellow colleagues when they forget sometimes maybe to use a mask or it's not being used properly. It's a critical thing. If we're able to introduce masks and everyone uses it, we could reduce the infection by more than half. I mean, which is a massive change from where we are currently. And we don't need to have these lockdowns, which has such a severe effect on the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Dr. Pillay, there's always this discussion, if you're following chats on social media, there are still discussions around whether masks are effective as a preventative measure for yourself and as a prevention to spread COVID-19 if you are yourself infected. What is the final word on this issue? Is there a final word, or is there still debate around the efficacy of masks?
No, the evidence on masks is very clear that having a mask on is more protective than not having a mask. The type of mask that you have and the how you put it on obviously will dictate the extent of the protection. There are some masks that are made of material that is highly porous, and which means that the level of protection is very low. But as the material becomes more dense and is able to prevent the virus from permeating through the layers of the mask, you have additional levels of protection. But if you were to use a 3-layer cloth mask, you basically are halving your risk of actually contracting COVID. And if you maintain the additional protection of making sure that there's good ventilation, you sanitize, etc., then I think that your chance of getting COVID will be very, very low. It's largely people that are in areas where they don't use a mask and they are indoors and no ventilation that have contracted COVID.
Yeah. There's one other issue that I just want to chat to you about, Dr. Pillay, in terms of the COVID-19 test. So those PCR tests, they test for the SARS coronavirus 2 virus, obviously. The disease is then COVID-19. So is it fair for us then to say that we have 8,000 new cases of COVID-19, the disease, when in fact we have 8,000 new cases of the virus, which may not lead to the disease?
Well, anybody who's infected with the virus is defined as having COVID. Whether they are symptomatic or asymptomatic, I suppose, is a clinical issue. As to some people go through the entire infection, as you pointed out, without having any symptoms. The problem, though, is that even though you may not have symptoms, you may be transmitting the virus to other people unknowingly, obviously. And that's how the virus is able to spread so easily. In the majority of people, they're actually asymptomatic, or they have very mild symptoms that they do not consider them to be serious to seek any medical care, but they are busy distributing the virus across all their contacts that they come in contact with. And not everybody handles the virus equally. So if your immune system is low, if you have other comorbidities such as diabetes, or you have are you obese, then obviously your ability to handle the virus when it infects you is far lower. And the consequence of which is that you may then have the adverse effects of it, having to be hospitalized, and God forbid you may even die from it.
Yeah. So it's neither here nor there. The issue comes down to whether you are asymptomatic or whether indeed you are displaying symptoms. But either way, you can be spreading it around.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Right. That's why we were using a mask, so that we protect ourselves firstly, but we're also doing the responsible thing and protecting somebody else, particularly if we don't know infected, right? Because we cannot do a PCR test every day and say, well, I'm virus free today, so I'm not using a mask. It's not plausible. It's not possible.
Yeah. Dr. Pillay, thanks so much for giving us a booster lesson on COVID-19. I think it's important that we all remind ourselves of these various issues as we are now in the grips of a second wave of infections. Dr. Anban Pillay is Deputy Director General of Health, joining us there as we continue to track various aspects of the coronavirus as it unfolds.